On this channel, I've done a lot of Loyalist to Chaos type conversions, but every now and again it's fun to imagine what a traditionally Chaos aligned force would be like if it had remained loyal to the Emperor. And in this video I'll be doing just that, with the Death Guard being the traitorous legion that I intend to redeem. I formed the basis of this conversion around the Heavy Intercessors, partly because I'm a big fan of the kit myself, but mainly because the size is reminiscent of the bulk of the Death Guard Legion's Terminator units, and a slight nod to the bloated look their plague-riddled members feature. It would also allow me to build a smaller model count force, should I want to expand this into a full army. Regular viewers of my Space Marine conversions and kit bashes will already know that I prefer to remove my Aquilers. This not only gives the model a more utilitarian appearance, but also opens up a lot of space for further customizations. To remove the design, the bulk of the plastic was first shaved away. Smaller cuts helped to make that kind of work a lot easier and safer. Once the bulk has been removed, the remaining plastic was scraped away so the surface was left smooth and featureless. A common feature of the pre-heresy Death Guard are the small round bumps known as molecular bonding studs. In the lore, these are essentially the result of ad hoc modifications to armor or field repairs, where they have been used to hold additional armor plating. Thematically, implementing these on our Death Guard works to give them that appearance of having sustained damage, but being tough enough to shrug it off. Creating these details is quite simple. First, I drilled a shallow 0.5mm deep hole into the armor surface using a 1mm drill bit. A number of these holes were evenly spaced out, and using a small piece of wire, some glue was added to each of them. In these holes, I carefully added some 1mm ball bearings where they sat with just the top half protruding, giving the impression of the stud. Making modifications to parts before assembly is generally much easier to do, as it not only avoids creating hard to reach areas, but also prevents you from accidentally breaking apart the model. With the chest scraped clean and some studs added, I was ready to assemble the model. For the heads, I decided to take the easy route and simply add some of the Mark VI Death Guard heads from Forge World. While it would have been much harder and prohibitively more expensive to rely on repurposed parts from other kits, the simple reason is that I really like the sculpts and wanted an excuse to use some. However, they are resin, which meant that they need to be soaked in warm soapy water, scrubbed and then rinsed to eliminate any mold release agents that may have been left behind. Attaching the heads was straightforward. After clipping them from the sprue, the heads needed a slight trim to allow them to fit against the shallower sockets in the Heavy Intercessor, but once this was done, the head could be superglued into place. Before completing the rest of the model's assembly by adding the shoulder pads and equipment. Now, normally when I build these kinds of models, I'll put several different modifications onto a single model, but this time around I would be building a whole squad, so I could spread them around. But first, the models needed to be assembled, and this was done in the same way as before, first by removing the chest-mounted Aquilers and then adding studs to the armor. These were added to various points across the armor though, rather than just the lower left leg, which helps to add a little more variety to the unit. One common feature of Heresy-era Death Guard are vents and pipes, so I was eager to recreate this iconic style on these Heavy Intercessors. One method of doing this was to dip into the ever-useful Mark III Space Marine kit and liberate one of the power packs from it. These come with perfect vents and pipes that, after a little careful cutting and trimming, could be repurposed and fixed to the front of one of the Intercessors. The result is that of a modified rebreather system that just helped to solidify that Death Guard look. From here, the assembly of the models was continued and more Mark VI Death Guard heads were added, but there was still one more modification to make. Sensors are a common detail among the ranks of the Death Guard, both in their pre- and post-Nurgle phases, and the wider Imperium in general. As such, there are plenty of sources for these incense-spilling spheres. This particular component came from the Tempesta Prime, but it needed to be separated from the servo skull. A careful clip helped remove the chain and sensor from the skull, whilst keeping both parts usable. After a little trimming to help the chain sit more naturally, the sensor was glued to the squad sergeant. And with that, the models were built and could be attached to their bases, which I also glued a few rough chunks of cork to, ready for their basing later on. But before we paint these guys, let's first hear a little bit about the sponsors of this video, Foxlink. VoxLink is an innovative app that makes it easy to find local tabletop gaming groups and events. And today I'm excited to tell you about their Kickstarter campaign and how you can support it. If you're watching this video, you're likely a fan of tabletop gaming, and you probably know how hard it can be sometimes to find a group to play with, or even arrange games with people outside of your usual opponents. But with this app, you can not only easily connect with other gamers in your area, but also find events to attend, all in one convenient place. VoxLink lets you search for opponents based on your interests and location. Whether you're looking for a small casual game or a large-scale competitive engagement, VoxLink has you covered. You can also create your own profile and share the cool things you're working on with others. Content is curated for you based on your preferences, so you don't need to trawl through numerous social media sites and groups to find what you want. But VoxLink needs your help, and with the support of backers like you, VoxLink will be able to connect gamers with local groups and events. The app will be free to use, but premium access will grant you discounts on events and select retailers, as well as giving you the option to create your own leagues and events. And by backing this project, you can grab yourself access to this premium membership at a discounted rate. So what are you waiting for? Head on over to the VoxLink Kickstarter to find out more about the project and pledge your support. You can find a link to the project in the comments below. Now, let's get back to painting. As always, the first step in painting was to prime, and for this I chose black. This was chosen to help create the dark shadows in the recesses and was applied via my airbrush, but feel free to apply your own primer in whatever way you prefer. To help create a little pre-shading, I decided to lightly spray a little Tamiya XF2 over the top of the primer. The airbrush was angled from above and slightly towards the left side of the model, so that the white paint built upon the upper and left side of the miniature, whilst keeping the deeper recesses and right-hand side as the darker black primer. This step isn't completely necessary, but it helps to alleviate some of the problems you face when painting directly over black, especially with lighter colours. It makes it much easier to get a good solid base coat while still benefiting from the dark, shaded recesses that a black primer offers. To create the iconic bone colour of the Heresy era Death Guard, I chose to use some Vampire Fang, which, like with most of the paints I'll be using in this guide, came from a Tooth and Coats range. Like with the white pre-shading, this was also applied through my airbrush. Here I applied several fine layers of paint, steadily building up the colour to ensure the coverage was smooth and even. As the paint built up, the pre-shading remained visible, helping to create the appearance of shadows. While the paint was applied more evenly across the model, I still tried to keep my main focus to those upper left sides, just to really push that difference between the light and shadow. With the airbrushing steps achieving a good starting point for the model, I could begin to block out the base colours with my regular brush. The first of these would be the dirty green of the shoulder pads. Unfortunately, the Tooth and Coats range lacks the specific colour, but this is easily resolved by creating a mixture of Ancient Forest and Ethereal Green, giving me the desired colour. This was then layered across the shoulders in several thin coats. Again, the aim here is to create a smooth and even coverage whilst benefiting from the pre-shading. From here, another mix of Dust Bowl and Ethereal Green was created. The resulting lighter green tone was used as a layer across the top parts of the shoulder pads. The trick with this sort of work is to thin the mix down quite heavily with water and apply several glazes. This will ensure the transition from the lighter point to the top of the shoulders is as smooth as it can be as it moves into the darker areas. In a similar fashion, some Ivory Tusk was also used to lighten up a few areas of the bone white armour. For the many areas of metal, rubber and non-armour areas, a layer of Death Reaper was applied. This black-grey colour helped to clean up these surfaces, giving a solid colour to build upon in the future. The leather areas, such as the pouches and belts, were all base coated with Scorched Earth, before having some of the raised areas lightened up with some steady glazes of Ancient Forest. Next up were the metallics. The first of these were the shoulder pads trim, the helmet spikes, and any other decorative details, and I base coated all of these using some Spartan Bronze, with some Surcoat Silver being used across the silver metallic details, which included parts of the weapons, the power pack vents, and other smaller armor details. Following the completion of the metallic paints, my paint water was changed to prevent any cross-contamination of metal flakes into my other paints. With the majority of the base coats in place, my next task was to add the decals. But before I grabbed my transfer sheet, I first applied a layer of gloss varnish to the areas that I intended to apply the decals to. While this was done with my airbrush, it's not necessary. It just speeds up the application a little. The main thing is that the gloss is applied as smoothly as possible, as the varnish is there to do two things. The first is to protect the paintwork already applied, and the second is to allow the decal to sit as close to the surface as possible, which will simply help to avoid that ghosting effect. Now that the surfaces were prepped, I cut out a few markings from the Death Guard Legion transfer sheet and left them to soak in some water. Once the transfers were lifting from the backing paper, I applied them to the previously varnished spots and left them to dry. But to create that painted on look, I would need to use some Microsol. This mild solvent is painted onto the decals where it will soften them and allow them to conform to the surface beneath. You might need to do this a couple of times to get the best effect, but just allow the Microsol to fully dry between applications. Once you are happy with the decal, you can fix everything into place with another coat of varnish. This time, I chose some matte varnish to help them blend back into the surrounding areas. With the decals in place, I could start to add some of the Death Guard's iconic weathering. This began with some Cuirass Leather being applied across the armor's surface. By applying some small lines and flecks, the reddish brown gave the appearance of scratches, peeling paint and rust patches in the painted surface. The trick here is to not be too uniform, and to focus on areas you'd reasonably expect to see wear and tear occur. Continuing with the weathering, I next applied my washes. The first of these was Archaic Sepia, and this was applied across the armor in order to create that dirty, off-white colour. I targeted this mainly into the recesses, but a few streaks and patches were also added to the armor, building up the scratches added in the last steps. Following the Archaic Sepia, the brown tone of Battle Mud Wash was applied across the metallic areas and the green shoulder pads. Again, this mainly flowed into the recesses where it created the appearance of shadows, but it also helped to dull down and dirty the areas it was applied across. With the washes complete, the next task was to pick out the edges of both the details and some of the scratches using fine lines of lighter paints. For the armor, Trooper White was used to stand out against the bone colour. For highlighting the shoulder pads, a mixture of Ethereal Green and Temple Stone was used to create a green that was a little lighter than the earlier base colours. The greyish blue of Wolf Grey was then selected for the black areas of the model and was applied in a scratchy and uneven way in order to give the weapon a more worn and damaged look. This was followed by a highlight of Wasteland Brown across the leather details. Before my attention turned towards the metallics. Here, I first used some Dragon's Gold across the bronze areas, and then picked out the details of the silver metallic surfaces with some Mythril Blade. Following the step, I once again refreshed my paint water. By this stage, most of my squad was complete, but there were just a few extra details on the sergeant that still needed to be painted. The first of these were the bare skin of the head, which was first base coated with Dwarven Skin, before being washed with some flesh wash. After allowing the wash to dry, a layer of Elven Skin was applied, and then followed up with a highlight of Ivory Tusk, giving the flesh a pallid appearance, another detail that is synonymous with the Heresy-era Death Guard. To paint the smoke emanating from the censer, I began with a base coat of Wolf Grey, followed by a layer of Gravestone Blue. To give the impression of the smoke having flecks of ash within it, I finished it off with a few small dots of Trooper White. These were grouped mainly towards the vents and became more spaced out as the smoke trailed off, giving the impression of density. One final, optional detail was to give the helmeted Death Guard some glowing green eyes. To prep for this, some white star was first painted into the lenses and the armor edge that sat immediately below them. In order to create that intense neon green, I decided to use some Techno Green from Scale 75's FX Fluor Experience range. After thinning out the paint in the same way as the earlier glazes, this neon green was applied across the eyes. The intensity of the colour contrasted strongly against the duller, dirty armour, helping to give the eyes a glowing green effect. With the models themselves complete, I could start work on the base. Feel free to choose whatever environment you prefer here, but I opted for a rusted red oxide desert, somewhere you'd expect the dangerous environment specialists of the Death Guard to fight in. This effect was created by first applying a liberal layer of AK Interactive's Fireland texture paste across the bases. After giving the paste plenty of time to completely dry, I then dry brush them in order to help pick out the rough texture. At first, I use some orange flare across the whole base, before then picking out the edges of the larger rocks using some dark sun yellow. To help better blend the Death Guard into their environment, I added water to some rust orange until I had a wash-like consistency. This was then targeted into the recessed areas around the feet and bottom of the legs. Once dried, it helps to create the appearance of dust accumulating and staining the armor. All that was left to do then was to clean up the rims of the bases with some Doom Death Black, and give everything a coat of matte varnish to help seal in the paintwork and to remove any glossiness left over from the earlier varnishes, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Primaris Death Guard squad. Now while this wasn't quite a dechaosification of a previously chaos-aligned miniature, imagining how a legion would have looked if it had not aligned itself with Horus was an interesting challenge. While the pre-heresy Death Guard miniatures provide a lot of inspiration, it was taking that aesthetic and applying it to Primaris models that was the trickier aspect. But I think I managed to strike a decent enough balance between the old and the new to create a unit that was recognizable as Death Guard while still being believable as Primaris. As I mentioned earlier in this guide, I am intending to grow this out slowly into a full force, and if you'd like to see how I tackle other units in this style, then let me know in the comments below, along with any other suggestions for alternative timeline kit bashes I could cover in future videos. For those of you looking to recreate these results for yourself, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliate links to where you can pick them up for yourself. Now, before I go, let me say a big thank you to my Patreon supporters and channel members who help keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters who are Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Jonathan Sandsteed, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Swedsman, and the Googles, and my Sergeant level channel members who are Whale Tussler and Philip Poyer. If you're interested in supporting me, you can hit the join button below or find a link to my Patreon in the description. Supporters get a whole host of benefits, including ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Speaking of merchandise, I also have a few t-shirts and mugs up for sale featuring designs drawn by me. You can check those out by following the links below or by going over to petethewargamer.com. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.